Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
When I first moved in, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The rent was reasonable, the place was clean, and best of all, there was a beautiful pool right outside my bedroom window. What could go wrong, right? Well, turns out that having a pool view comes with some serious downsides when you're a night shift worker who needs to sleep during odd hours. I work at a local hospital from midnight to 8 in the morning, which means I usually get home around 9 and need to catch some sleep before my next shift. The apartment walls are paper thin, and every conversation, splash, and laugh from the pool area comes through loud and clear. At first, I didn't mind too much. The pool was supposed to close at 10 in the evening according to the lease agreement and the posted signs. I figured I could deal with some noise until then, and after that I'd have peace and quiet to rest up for work. But summer hit, and suddenly the rules didn't seem to matter anymore. It started with just a few teenagers staying past closing time. Then it became regular groups of college kids treating the pool like their personal party venue until 2 or 3 in the morning. The worst nights were when they'd bring portable speakers and blast music while screaming and splashing around until 4 in the morning. I tried being reasonable about it first. I called the front office during business hours and explained the situation. The manager told me they couldn't monitor the pool area all the time and suggested I call the police for noise complaints instead. So I did. The next time a group was partying at 2 in the morning, I called a non-emergency line. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in danger, and when I said no, they told me there was no county noise ordinance they could enforce. They said unless someone's life was threatened or property was being damaged, they couldn't do much about it. They told me to contact apartment management about lease violations instead. Back to square one. I called the front office again and got the same runaround. They said they'd look into it, but nothing changed. Week after week, I'd lie in bed listening to pool parties that went on until the early morning hours. That's when I remembered something interesting about Texas law. While there might not be a noise ordinance, there are definitely laws about obscenity and disturbing the peace with offensive language. And I happen to know that the cops would absolutely respond to complaints about loud, explicit music. Last Friday night, right on schedule, a group of college kids showed up at the pool around 9:30. By 10:15, they were in full party mode with music blasting and people screaming. I grabbed my Bluetooth speaker, the good one I use for my morning workouts, and opened my bedroom window that faces the pool area. What's New Pussycat by Tom Jones started playing at a nice, healthy volume, over and over and over again. The party people started asking each other what the hell that was and commenting that someone was playing the same song on repeat. One guy said it was probably some old person trying to mess with them. I shouted from my window that the pool had closed 15 minutes ago and it was time to go. One girl yelled back that they didn't have to listen to me because it was a common area. I agreed with her that it was indeed a common area, which meant I could play my music too. I cranked up the volume a little more. Tom Jones kept asking what's new, Pussycat, whoa. It took exactly 23 minutes before they packed up and left, complaining about crazy neighbors. Saturday morning, there was an email from the front office in my inbox. It reminded all residents that the pool area closed at 10 sharp and announced they would be locking the pool gates at closing time to ensure compliance with community rules. Saturday night, they actually did lock the gates. I had blissful silence and got a full night's sleep before my shift. But Sunday, the gates were wide open again, and by 10:30 there was a full-blown party happening. At least 20 people, multiple speakers, and someone had even brought a cooler full of drinks. I didn't even hesitate. Out came my speaker, and Tom Jones started his eternal question about pussycats. Some woman who seemed to be the ringleader started screaming that this was harassment and that I couldn't just play the same song over and over. I called back that actually I could, since there was no noise ordinance, just like they had told the cops. She insisted this was different because I was doing it on purpose to annoy them. I pointed out that They were partying past closing hours on purpose to ignore the rules, so it was funny how that worked. She shouted that they had just as much right to be there as I did. I explained that actually they didn't, since the pool had closed 30 minutes ago while I was in my own home playing music at a reasonable volume. The music kept going. What's new, pussycat? Whoa, oh, 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 on endless repeat. Some guy tried to throw a pool noodle at my window, but it fell short. A few people started shouting obscenities, which I made sure to record on my phone. The ringleader kept ranting about her rights while Tom Jones kept singing. After about 25 minutes, people started leaving in small groups. The angry woman held out the longest, standing by the pool with her arms crossed, looking at my window. She yelled that this wasn't over and that she was reporting me to management. I told her to go ahead, since I was sure they'd love to hear about how she was organizing parties past closing hours. She finally walked off around 11:15. Monday morning brought another email from management, this time announcing they were hiring a security company to monitor the pool area in the evenings. Turns out several other residents had been complaining too, and my little Tom Jones concerts had apparently been the final straw that got them to take action. The woman did try to file a complaint about me, but when management reviewed the situation, they sided with me completely. Playing music from inside my own apartment wasn't a lease violation, but organizing parties past closing hours definitely was. The security guard started that week, and suddenly the pool area was quiet as a church after 10 o'clock every night. I finally started getting the sleep I needed, and my Tom Jones playlist got a well-deserved break. I've been working in finance for about 6 years now, starting right out of college. When I first got hired at this company 3 years ago, I was excited about the opportunity. The pay was decent, my direct manager seemed supportive, and I thought I could really make a name for myself here. I quickly became known as someone who would stay late, work weekends, and tackle the tough projects. Everything was going pretty smoothly until about 8 months ago when our company decided to implement a major platform change. This wasn't just a simple software update. We're talking about completely overhauling the system we use for all our financial reporting and analysis. The timeline was aggressive, to put it mildly. Our vice president pushed for a 6-month implementation when everyone on the ground knew it should take at least a year. But I figured this was my chance to really prove myself. I started putting in 70 to 75-hour weeks, coming in early, staying late, working most weekends. My mental health started suffering pretty quickly. I was exhausted all the time, barely seeing my friends, and my relationship was getting strained. But I kept telling myself it would all be worth it when the project was done, and management saw how hard I'd worked. The platform launch was a disaster. Nothing worked the way it was supposed to. Key reports were throwing errors, data wasn't syncing properly, and we were getting constant complaints from other departments who needed access to the information. I was putting out fires left and right, sometimes working until midnight, just to get basic functions operational for the next day. Most of my co-workers were struggling too, but I was definitely putting in the most hours. I thought surely management would recognize that I was carrying more than my fair share of the load. I was dead wrong. Last month, our vice president called me into his office. I thought he might be giving me some kind of recognition or maybe discussing a promotion. Instead, he sat me down and basically tore me apart. He told me he'd been looking at the hours I was putting in, and frankly, it was a shame. When I asked what he meant, he explained that I was working 70+ hours a week, and we were still having all these issues with the platform. He asked if I realized how much money they spent on this new system. I was stunned. I tried to explain that the problems weren't due to lack of effort on my part, but due to the rushed timeline and poor planning. I told him I thought the issues we were seeing were because we didn't have enough time to properly test everything before launch, and that the timeline was really tight. He cut me off and said that was exactly the problem. He told me that if I couldn't learn to be more efficient with my time, maybe they needed to start looking at artificial intelligence solutions. He said they needed technology that could actually get the job done without all this hand-holding. The implication was crystal clear. He was basically telling me I was bad at my job and suggesting I could be replaced by artificial intelligence. This was after months of me sacrificing my personal life and mental health to try to make his unrealistic timeline work. I tried to tell him I understood he was frustrated with the platform issues, but I've been working around the clock to resolve them. I started to explain that most of these problems stemmed from the rushed implementation, but he interrupted me again. He said he didn't want to hear excuses and wanted to see results. He told me that if they couldn't get results with the current approach, they'd find a different approach. That conversation was my wake-up call. I walked out of his office feeling humiliated and angry, but also strangely liberated. I realized I'd been killing myself for someone who not only didn't appreciate my efforts, but was actively blaming me for problems that weren't my fault. So I made a decision. Starting the next week, I cut my hours back to 45 per week. No more weekends, no more staying until 9 or 10 at night. I did my job competently, but I stopped going above and beyond. I still put in a little extra effort out of respect for my direct manager, who has always treated me fairly and supported me, but the days of me volunteering for everything were over. The results were immediate and telling. Within 2 weeks, the problems with the platform started piling up faster than anyone could handle. Reports that I had been manually fixing during my overtime hours started failing consistently. Data integrity issues that I'd been catching and correcting on weekends began causing major problems for other departments. I wasn't being malicious. I was just doing exactly what I was being paid to do during the hours I was being paid to do it. But apparently the whole system had been depending on my unpaid overtime to function even marginally well. I started quietly sharing what the vice president had said to me with a few of my co-workers. Their reactions were unanimous. They were appalled at how he treated me. One co-worker said he actually told me artificial intelligence could replace me after everything I'd done to keep this project afloat. Another said it was insane, pointing out that I'd been putting in more hours than anyone, and if anything, I'd been keeping this whole thing from being a complete catastrophe. Word spread pretty quickly through our team. It turns out everyone had their own stories about the vice president being unreasonable, setting impossible deadlines, and then blaming the staff when things inevitably went wrong. But we'd all been too busy working ourselves to death to really talk about it before. One by one, my co-workers started scaling back their hours too, not in a coordinated way or anything dramatic, just quietly establishing better boundaries and refusing to work unpaid overtime to compensate for poor planning from above. The impact was swift and undeniable. Projects started missing deadlines. The platform issues that had been barely manageable became a full-blown crisis. Other departments started complaining directly to the chief executive officer about not being able to get the reports and data they needed. The breaking point came when one of my most experienced co-workers, someone who'd been with the company for over 8 years, decided to quit. She'd been handling some of the most complex aspects of our financial analysis, work that honestly required a level of expertise that we're all underpaid for. Her resignation letter was professional, but she made it clear to our direct manager that the unrealistic expectations and lack of support from upper management were major factors in her decision to leave. Suddenly, the vice president was in full panic mode. He tried to convince her to stay, offered her a small raise, and promised things would get better, but she'd already made up her mind and had another job lined up. He told her they couldn't afford to lose someone with her experience right now and asked what it would take to keep her. She responded honestly, saying it wasn't about money, but about being set up for failure, and then blamed when things didn't work out. She told him she was tired of working 70-hour weeks just to be told she wasn't doing enough. After she left, the vice president was forced to hire someone new for my immediate team. The recruiting process was a nightmare. Turns out it's pretty hard to find someone willing to do highly specialized financial work for below-market wages while being expected to work constant overtime. Meanwhile, the platform issues were getting worse, not better. Without my co-workers and me working unpaid overtime to patch problems and manually fix errors, it became obvious that the real issue was the system itself, not our efficiency. Key reports that were supposed to be automated were completely non-functional. Requirements that should have been built into the platform from the beginning were missing entirely. The chief executive officer started asking pointed questions about why a system that cost so much money was performing so poorly. The vice president, who had been so quick to blame us frontline workers, suddenly found himself having to explain to his boss why the expensive new platform was actually making our jobs more complicated instead of streamlined. During one tense team meeting, the vice president's tune had completely changed. He acknowledged that the transition had been challenging for everyone and mentioned they were looking at bringing in additional resources to help address some of the ongoing issues with the platform. It was almost comical how different his attitude was now that he was feeling pressure from above and dealing with staffing shortages. The same person who had suggested I could be replaced by artificial intelligence was now scrambling to hire more human workers and trying to figure out how to retain the ones he still had. My direct manager, who I still respect greatly, pulled me aside after that meeting. She told me she wanted me to know that she'd been advocating for me and the team with upper management. She said the way I was spoken to a few months ago was completely inappropriate, and she'd made that clear to the higher-ups. I thanked her for that support and told her it had been a frustrating time, but I was glad we were finally seeing some recognition of what the real problems were. She agreed and said that for what it was worth, my decision to establish better work-life boundaries had actually helped highlight how unrealistic their expectations were. She pointed out that sometimes it takes stepping back to see the bigger picture. She was right. By refusing to continue working unsustainable hours to compensate for poor planning, I'd inadvertently exposed the fundamental flaws in the project management and timeline. The problems weren't due to worker inefficiency. They were due to an executive pushing through an unrealistic implementation schedule and then expecting his staff to make up the difference with unpaid labor. I've been quietly job searching for the past few weeks. I've had several promising interviews, and I'm confident I'll have an offer soon. I'm looking at positions that actually pay market rate for my level of expertise and don't expect me to work myself into the ground to compensate for management failures. I can't wait to see how the vice president handles my departure. The new hire is still learning the basics. One of our most experienced people already quit. The platform issues are still far from resolved. Without me there to work unpaid overtime patching problems and keeping things running, I have a feeling the true scope of this project's failure is about to become very apparent to everyone involved. The irony isn't lost on me that the person who suggested artificial intelligence could replace me might soon be wishing he had treated his human workers better. Turns out that complex financial analysis, problem solving, and institutional knowledge aren't quite as easy to automate as he thought. When you drive away the people who actually understand how to do the work, you're left with expensive technology that nobody knows how to fix when it breaks. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I've been training in mixed martial arts for 8 years now. I compete professionally, though I'm not exactly a household name yet. Most people wouldn't recognize me on the street, which is usually fine by me. The whole mess started because I needed to pick up some protein powder and vegetables after my morning training session. I was still wearing my gym clothes, just a plain t-shirt and shorts. Nothing that screamed fighter to anyone passing by. I'm a pretty big guy, around 6'2" and about 190 pounds of muscle, but I've always been careful about how I carry myself in public. When you know how to hurt people, you have a responsibility not to. I was walking through the parking lot minding my own business when this kid on a bicycle came flying around the corner of a parked SUV. He must have been going 15 miles per hour easy. The kid wasn't paying attention at all, probably looking at his phone or something. I had maybe half a second to react before he would have plowed right into me. I dodged to the right, stepping quickly out of the way. The kid whooshed past me, completely oblivious to how close he'd come to a collision. But in my quick movement to avoid him, I accidentally bumped into a woman who was walking behind me. I didn't see her coming because I was focused on not getting run down by the bicycle. The bump wasn't gentle. She was a middle-aged woman, probably in her 50s, and when my shoulder connected with hers, she lost her balance and went down hard on the asphalt. Her purse scattered its contents everywhere, and she scraped her knee pretty badly. I immediately felt terrible. I rushed over to help her up and apologized, explaining that there had been a kid on a bike and I had to move fast to avoid getting hit. I told her I was really sorry and asked if she was okay. She was getting to her feet and I could see she was really angry. She yelled at me, asking what was wrong with me, and accusing me of pushing her down on purpose. I tried to explain again that I really didn't mean to hurt her and that I was just trying to avoid getting hit by that bicycle. I offered to help her gather up her things that had scattered from her purse. I started collecting her items, keys, wallet, makeup, receipts, but she got even angrier and told me not to touch her stuff. She screamed that I had assaulted her. I promised her it was an accident and offered to pay for any medical bills if she was hurt. I was trying my best to be reasonable and make things right. That's when things went from bad to worse. Without any warning, she hauled back and slapped me across the face as hard as she could. The sound echoed through the parking lot like a gunshot. My cheek stung, and I could feel the heat spreading across my face. I just stood there, shocked. A crowd was starting to gather, people stopping to watch what was happening. Some were recording with their phones. I knew I had to stay calm, even though every instinct I'd trained for years was telling me to defend myself. I asked her not to hit me and told her I understood she was upset, but that hitting me wasn't going to solve anything. She was screaming now, saying she would do whatever she wanted and that I had attacked her first. More people were gathering around us. I could see some folks were pulling out their phones to record. I kept my hands at my sides, trying to show everyone that I wasn't being aggressive. She accused me of thinking I could push women around just because I was big. I tried to tell her that wasn't what happened and that I was trying to apologize and make things right. But she wasn't listening. She wound up for another slap, this one aimed at the other side of my face. That's where my training kicked in, not the fighting part, but the defensive part. When someone swings at you, you protect yourself. I caught her wrist when her hand came toward my face. It was purely reflexive, but she was putting so much force into the slap that when I stopped her hand, her own momentum carried her forward and she flipped over, landing on her back on the ground again. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed, and that's when I heard the sirens. Apparently, someone had already called the police when they saw the woman go down the first time. 2 officers came running over, and of course, what they saw was a big guy standing over a woman who was on the ground. One of the officers shouted at me to step away from her right now. I immediately put my hands up and backed away, telling them that this was all a misunderstanding. The other officer told me to turn around and put my hands behind my back. They cuffed me right there in the parking lot, while the woman was screaming about how I'd attacked her. I didn't resist or argue. I just kept telling them that there were witnesses and asking them to check with the people who saw what really happened. One officer asked the woman if she needed medical attention. She said yes and told them that I had pushed her down twice. She demanded that I be arrested for assault. They put me in the back of the police car while they talked to witnesses. I could see them interviewing people, and thankfully several folks were telling them what they saw. The kid on the bicycle had even come back when he saw the commotion. After about 20 minutes, the officers came back to the car. One of them explained that they had talked to several witnesses, and they all said the same thing. The first contact was accidental, and the second time was me defending myself when she tried to hit me again. The other officer told me they were going to uncuff me, but that I needed to come to the station to give a statement. When they let me out of the car, the woman was still there, and she was furious. She was yelling that this was ridiculous and that I had assaulted her. She threatened to sue me. One officer told her that based on witness statements, she had struck me first after an accidental collision, and that was assault. She insisted that I was lying and that everyone was lying. The other officer explained that they had multiple independent witnesses, and some people had recorded parts of the incident on their phones. That's when they told me I could press charges against her for assault. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to at first. The whole thing seemed like it had gotten out of hand enough already. But then she started threatening to sue me and telling the officers that she was going to ruin my life for what I'd done to her. I decided that yes, I wanted to press charges. They arrested her right there in the parking lot. She was screaming about how unfair it was when they put her in handcuffs, and put her in the other police car. She yelled that this was discrimination and that they were taking my side because I was a man. One of the officers told her they were taking the witness's side because they saw what actually happened. At the station, I gave my statement and found out that 3 different people had recorded at least part of the incident. The videos clearly showed her hitting me first and then trying to hit me again before I defended myself. The woman was charged with assault, and I never heard from her again. The whole thing was settled when she agreed to pay a fine and attend anger management classes. The kid on the bicycle even came to the police station with his mom to apologize for causing the whole mess in the first place. He felt terrible that his careless riding had led to everything that happened. One of the videos ended up online, and for about a week, I was that MMA fighter who got arrested for self-defense. It wasn't exactly the kind of fame I was looking for, but at least people could see what really happened. So this happened a few weeks ago, and I'm still pretty annoyed about it. I'm 20 years old, and I've been living at home while I finish up my degree. My uncle and his 14-year-old daughter have been staying with us for the past month because their house is being renovated after some water damage. I should probably mention that I'm a pretty avid reader. I got tons of books in my room, everything from classic literature to modern fiction. When I was 16 and 17, I took advanced level English literature and had to analyze a bunch of books for my exams. I'm the kind of person who writes notes all over my books while I'm reading them. My handwriting back then was absolutely terrible, so most of my old study books are covered in these messy scribbles that probably only make sense to me. When my uncle and cousin first moved in, my mom pulled me aside and told me I needed to be more careful about what books I left lying around. She said some of my collection might be inappropriate for a 14-year-old and asked me to put certain ones away. I understood her point, so I gathered up the most obviously adult books, the ones with explicit content or really mature themes, and locked them in a small drawer in my desk. The thing is, that drawer isn't very big. I could only fit maybe 10 books in there, so I had to make some choices about what to lock up and what to leave on my shelves. I kept out books like The Handmaid's Tale and some of my other dystopian novels because I figured they were more literary than inappropriate. Plus, The Handmaid's Tale was completely covered in my old study notes from when I analyzed it for my literature exam. The margins were full of my terrible handwriting pointing out themes and literary devices. I honestly thought no one else would want to read through all that mess. My cousin seemed pretty quiet and mostly kept to herself. She'd come into the room to sleep but spent most of her time downstairs watching TV or on her phone. I didn't think she was paying much attention to my bookshelf. Well, I was wrong about that. Last Tuesday, I came home from my afternoon classes and walked into my room to find my uncle standing there holding The Handmaid's Tale, looking absolutely furious. My cousin was sitting on her bed looking like she'd been caught stealing. My uncle demanded to know what the book was, acting like he'd never seen it before. I told him it was just a book, but that seemed to make him angrier. He asked if I knew what it was about, and when I tried to explain that I'd studied it for my literature class, he cut me off. He started yelling about how it was about sex and violence and was completely inappropriate for a child. My cousin tried to speak up and explain that she was just reading it for a reason, but he shut her down immediately. Then he turned on me and said I should know better than to expose her to that kind of material. I tried to defend myself by explaining that my mom had asked me to put away inappropriate books, and I had done that. I told him I kept this one out because it was a classic piece of literature, but he wasn't having any of it. He called it filth and said he'd found her reading about things no 14-year-old should be reading about. I kept trying to explain that it was taught in schools and wasn't some trashy novel, that it dealt with serious themes about society, but he didn't care about any of that. He said I was being careless by leaving something like that where she could get to it. My cousin finally managed to get a word in and told him that she knew what the book was about before she started reading it. She said they'd talked about it in her English class at school, but her dad said that wasn't the point. He said the point was that it was irresponsible to leave it out. He turned back to me and said my mother had specifically asked me to be more careful, and I had failed to do that. He insisted this was exactly the kind of book that should have been locked away. I was getting pretty frustrated at this point. I spent time going through my collection and making thoughtful decisions about what to put away. I followed my mom's instructions as best I could with the limited space I had. I told him I had made a judgment call and locked away the books that were actually inappropriate. I explained that this was a piece of classic literature that I'd studied in school. But he got even more angry and said I was 20 years old, not a parent, and I didn't get to make judgment calls about what was appropriate for his daughter. I suggested that maybe he should have gone through the books himself if he was so concerned about it. That really set him off. He asked if I was telling him how to parent his child. I said no. I was just pointing out that if he had specific concerns about what she might read, he could have looked at the bookshelf instead of assuming I would know exactly what he considered inappropriate. He said he shouldn't have to check every single book in the house and that I should have used common sense. My cousin looked really uncomfortable with the whole argument and asked if we could just drop it, saying she'd stop reading the book, but her father said no, we weren't dropping it because this was about responsibility and respect. He kept flipping through the book, getting more worked up when he saw my annotations. He pointed out all the notes about the themes and said, I clearly knew it was inappropriate if I was analyzing all these adult concepts. I explained that those notes were from when I was 17 and studying it for my exam, and that the whole point of literature class was to analyze themes, even difficult ones. He said 17 was still too young for that kind of content. I pointed out that apparently my teachers and the education system disagreed with him on that. He told me not to get sarcastic with him. At this point, my mom came upstairs to see what all the shouting was about. My uncle immediately told her that I had left inappropriate books where his daughter could read them, despite her specific instructions to be more careful. My mom looked at the book in his hands and said she recognized The Handmaid's Tale from something I'd studied for my literature exam. My uncle said he didn't care what I'd studied it for because it wasn't appropriate for a 14-year-old. My mom said it was a classic novel that was taught in many high schools. My uncle responded that it wasn't taught in schools with proper standards. My mom's expression changed when he said that. She doesn't like it when people criticize her parenting decisions or imply that our family doesn't have proper standards. She told him she thought he was overreacting and that it was literature, not inappropriate material. My uncle asked if she thought it was fine for a 14-year-old to read about sexual slavery and violence. My mom said she thought context mattered and that the book wasn't glorifying those things but criticizing them. He said that wasn't the point and that I had been careless. My mom said I had followed her instructions by putting away books that were inappropriate and leaving out books that were considered literature. My uncle said our standards were clearly different from his. My mom told him that maybe he should supervise his daughter's reading more closely instead of expecting everyone else to do it for him. The room went very quiet after that. My uncle looked like he wanted to say something really nasty, but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Finally, he said that, from now on, his daughter wasn't allowed to touch any of my books without his permission. He gestured at my entire bookshelf when he said it. I pointed out that those were my books in my room. He said that, since she was sleeping in my room, they affected her too. My mom said she thought we needed to have a conversation about boundaries and expectations while they were staying here. My uncle asked what that was supposed to mean. She explained that this was our house, and while we were happy to help him during his renovations, he didn't get to dictate how we managed our household or criticize our standards. He said he was just trying to protect his daughter. My mom said she was trying to protect me from being blamed for his parenting anxieties. My cousin finally spoke up again and asked if she could just say something. She explained that she had asked to read the book because they were reading 1984 in her English class and her teacher had mentioned that The Handmaid's Tale was similar. She said she wanted to compare them and that she wasn't traumatized or corrupted or whatever. Her dad looked at her like she'd betrayed him and asked why she hadn't asked him first. She said it was because she knew he'd say no without even thinking about it. He said of course he'd say no because it wasn't appropriate. She pointed out that it was being taught in schools and that her teacher has specifically mentioned it as an important dystopian novel. My uncle said her teacher was wrong. My mom decided she'd had enough and said the conversation was over. She told my uncle that he was welcome to stay until his house was ready, but he needed to respect that this was our home and our rules. She said if he had concerns about what his daughter was exposed to here, they could discuss them calmly, but he didn't get to berate me for following her instructions. My uncle said her instructions were clearly insufficient. My mom said her instructions were fine, and that his reaction was what was excessive. My uncle said fine, they were going to stay at a hotel until the house was ready. My cousin said that was ridiculous and asked if they couldn't just work things out. Her father said no, that clearly their standards didn't align with our households. My mom told him that was his choice, but they were always welcome here if he could be respectful. My uncle asked how he was supposed to be respectful when he was the one being disrespected. Then he walked out of the room, still clutching my book. My cousin looked embarrassed and apologetic. She said she was sorry she caused all this drama and that she didn't think he'd react so badly. I told her it wasn't her fault and that she hadn't done anything wrong by reading a book. She said she really did want to read it for educational reasons and wasn't looking for inappropriate content. I said I believed her, that, honestly, there were way more explicit things on regular TV than anything in that book. My mom told us we didn't need to apologize for anything and that sometimes adults have unreasonable reactions to things. We could hear my uncle downstairs loudly talking on his phone, presumably booking a hotel room. An hour later, they were gone. My uncle never did give me my book back. He took it with him. I had to buy a new copy, which annoyed me because I actually liked having my old study notes in there. The funny thing is, 2 days later, my cousin texted me asking if I could recommend any other dystopian novels for her to read. Apparently, the whole incident just made her more interested in the genre. I sent her a list of age-appropriate titles and suggested she check them out from the public library. Her dad still hasn't spoken to my mom or me. I come from a traditional family where Sunday dinners were sacred and everyone had opinions about everything. My sister and I learned early on that family gatherings could be a minefield, especially when certain relatives decided to share their unsolicited wisdom. But nothing prepared me for what happened after my sister had her first baby. My sister had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years. She and her husband went through fertility treatments, miscarriages, and countless disappointments. When she finally got pregnant and carried the baby to full term, our whole family was over the moon. She'd been so careful throughout the pregnancy, reading every book, going to every appointment, doing everything right. When little one finally arrived, he was perfect, healthy, beautiful, and my sister was glowing with happiness. She and her husband had spent months choosing his name. They wanted something classic but not too common, meaningful but not pretentious. They settled on a lovely name that suited him perfectly. The baby was about 2 weeks old when we had our first big family dinner since his birth. My sister was still recovering but felt ready to show him off to everyone. She'd been looking forward to this moment for years, imagining introducing her son to all the aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd been waiting to meet him. Everyone was gathered in my parents' dining room, passing the baby around, cooing over his tiny fingers and toes. My sister was beaming, finally able to share her joy with the whole family. The conversation was light and happy, with everyone sharing stories about their own babies and commenting on who the little guy looked like. That's when my aunt decided to make her grand entrance into the conversation. She'd been relatively quiet up until then, but I should have known she was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Karen suddenly asked my sister if she had picked a name from the Bible. My sister looked confused for a second, still riding the high of new motherhood. She explained that they had just picked what felt right to them. The room got a little quieter. I could sense the shift in energy, but my sister hadn't picked up on it yet. Karen then told my sister that she should change the baby's name. She said that the name had no meaning and that they needed a strong name from scripture, suggesting names like Matthew or Elijah. I watched my sister's face change. The smile faded and was replaced by something between confusion and hurt. My sister told Karen that the birth certificate was already done and that they loved his name because it had meaning to them. But Karen wasn't done, not even close. She went on to say that the name didn't follow family tradition and that my sister should respect that. She pointed out that every generation in their family had biblical names, listing off relatives like their great-grandfather Moses, grandfather David, and father Mark. My sister said she didn't realize there was a requirement for biblical names. Karen responded that of course there was a requirement because it was tradition. She accused my sister of thinking she knew better than generations of family custom. I could see my sister's hands starting to shake a little. She was holding her baby closer to her chest, like she was protecting him from the words being thrown around. I tried to interrupt, suggesting that maybe this wasn't the right time for this conversation. Karen turned to me with that look I'd seen countless times growing up. The look that said I was being disrespectful and needed to stay in my lane. Karen said this was exactly the right time, before anyone got too attached to a name that didn't belong in the family. She went on about how names have power and shape who a person becomes. She criticized my sister for making something up just because it sounded nice. My sister defended their choice, explaining that they didn't make it up and that it was a perfectly normal name with a beautiful meaning. Karen shot back that it wasn't a biblical meaning and didn't honor God or their family's faith. My sister's husband, who'd been quietly fuming in the corner, finally spoke up. He told Karen that with all due respect, they appreciated her concern, but this was their decision to make. Karen argued that it wasn't just their decision when it affected the whole family. She said that this child would carry their family name and represent all of them. That's when I'd had enough. I watched my sister's eyes fill with tears, and something in me snapped. I told Karen that the baby was 2 weeks old and didn't represent anything except his parents' love. I pointed out that she didn't give birth to him, so she didn't get a vote on his name. Karen said that, as his great-aunt, she had every right to voice her concerns about family matters. I told her that her concerns had been noted and suggested she congratulate my sister on her healthy baby, instead of criticizing her parenting choices. Karen said she wasn't criticizing but educating. She said that clearly no one had explained to my sister how important this decision was. My mother, who'd been washing dishes in the kitchen, came back into the dining room and immediately sensed the tension. She asked what was going on, and Karen explained that she was just trying to help them understand the family naming tradition since they had chosen a name that didn't fit. Mom looked at my sister, who was now quietly crying while holding her baby. She told Karen that the only tradition she cared about was welcoming new babies with love and support. She suggested that if Karen couldn't do that, maybe she should head home early. Karen warned that we would all regret this when the baby grew up confused about his identity and his place in the family. My sister fired back that the only thing he would be confused about was why his great-aunt thought she had the right to name him. That's when Karen made her biggest mistake. She threatened to call my sister's pastor to explain why this mattered, saying they obviously needed spiritual guidance on this decision. The room went dead silent. Even Karen seemed to realize she'd crossed a line, but she was too proud to back down. My brother-in-law told her that she absolutely would not contact their pastor about their personal family decisions. He warned that if she did, they would be having a very different conversation about boundaries and respect. Karen said fine, but told them not to come crying to her when this choice caused problems down the road. She said that some traditions exist for good reasons. Then she grabbed her purse and walked out, leaving the rest of us sitting in stunned silence. My dad, who'd been quietly watching the whole thing unfold, walked over to my sister and gently took her hand. He told her that the name was perfect for the baby and suited him already. He added that anyone who couldn't see that didn't deserve to be part of his story. 3 months later, Karen called my sister to apologize. Apparently, her own daughter had told her in no uncertain terms that her behavior was unacceptable and embarrassing. She wanted to rebuild the relationship and be part of her great-nephew's life. My sister, being the bigger person, accepted the apology. But she also made it clear that any future comments about parenting decisions would result in limited contact. Karen agreed, probably realizing she'd almost lost access to her great-nephew over her own stubbornness. The baby is now 6 months old and his name fits him perfectly. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.